When the HOA tore down my family's bridge for their resort view, they forgot one thing. My father built the dam, and I still held the key. The bridge wasn't just wood and nails, it was memory. I built it with my own hands, connecting my cabin to the little island where my father used to fish. It was more than a walkway, it was legacy, but the HOA saw it differently. One morning, I woke to bulldozers and men in neon vests tearing it down, the president of the HOA, Richard, standing there with his smug grin. Violation of community standards, he said flatly, like it was just paperwork. To me, it was like ripping out a piece of my family's history. Later, I learned the truth. The HOA didn't care about bylaws. They wanted the lake. Investors had approached them about building a luxury resort, and my little bridge was in the way of their perfect lake view. Richard and his board had dollar signs in their eyes, and my heritage meant nothing compared to their profit. The moon hung low over the lake, its pale light rippling across the water's surface like broken glass. I walked slowly along the shoreline, the cold mud pulling at my boots, each step sinking with a quiet squelch. The night smelled of damp pine and stone, the same way it had when I was a boy following my father's shadow as he worked. In the silence, I heard him again. His voice didn't come from memory. It came from the water, from the stones of the dam itself, as though his spirit had seeped into the cracks between them. This lake stays ours. No matter who comes, no matter what they demand, this lake is ours. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could almost see him. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands blistered from hauling rock after rock, sweat mixing with river water as he built the wall that would hold back generations of greed. He hadn't built it for profit. He hadn't built it for glory. He built it for us, our family, our name, our bloodline. Now that legacy was being chipped away by signatures on HOA paper and smug grins from people who never lifted a stone in their lives. They hadn't just torn down my bridge. They had desecrated everything he left behind. I crouched by the water's edge, dragging my fingers through the black surface. The cold bit into my skin, but I didn't pull away. The reflection of the clubhouse lights shimmered across the lake, arrogant and bright, casting long lines across what used to be untouched darkness. Every ripple carried a memory. Me learning to swim while my father held me steady, my mother watching from the shore, the summer nights when neighbors gathered here because the water meant community, not control. Now those echoes felt like ghosts. The laughter was gone. The shoreline stood bare where trees had been cut for a better view. The bridge, my bridge, reduced to rubble so vacationers could stare at a wider horizon. I clenched a fistful of wet earth. "You broke your promise, Dad," I whispered, though I knew it wasn't him who failed. It was me for letting them. For watching as signatures and bylaws tore down what stone and sweat had protected for decades. But as the night deepened, another thought pressed in, heavier than the water behind the dam. The lake was more than just land. It was power. My father had always hinted at it, but never explained. "They don't understand," he'd said once, his voice low, secretive. "Without this dam, they're nothing. Remember that." I stared out at the still, endless water, and for the first time I understood. They thought they had taken something from me, but they hadn't. Not yet. The lake still listened, and I still held the key. The hammering started before dawn. By the time the mist lifted off the lake, the quiet mornings I'd cherished were already gone. Where there had once been the soft rustle of reeds and the call of loons, there was now the shriek of saws, the thud of pylons being driven into the earth, and men barking orders over the rumble of machinery. The HOA moved fast, too fast. It was as though they had been waiting, permits signed and blueprints tucked in drawers, long before they ever tore down my bridge. By the end of the first week, raw wooden frames sprouted like weeds along the shoreline. By the second, a lattice of docks stretched out across the water, cutting into the lake's reflection like scars. Every board they nailed down felt like another insult. My father's lake, our lake, was being carved up and sold in glossy packages. The HOA called it progress, but I called it desecration. Their newsletters arrived weekly now, stuffed into my mailbox whether I wanted them or not. Smiling stock photos of families in pastel polo shirts and wide-brimmed hats were plastered across the pages. Words like exclusive access, lakeside living, and investment paradise were repeated over and over, as though they could hypnotize anyone who read them. And right in the middle of it all, projected value for million-dollar resort community. They bragged about it openly, how the docks would host parties, how cabins would be rented to vacationers, how they were bringing prosperity to the area. Prosperity for them, not for me. I stood outside my cabin one evening, arms crossed, as the sun dipped behind the half-built structures. My cabin, the place my father built with his own hands, where every nail had a story, now looked like a stubborn old relic, dark and weathered, standing alone against the invasion of polished timber and shining glass. And that was how they described it, too. In one of their board meetings, voices carrying across the water through the night air, I overheard them laughing. His shack? It ruins the symmetry of the shoreline, one man said. It's an eyesore. Doesn't fit the brochure. Another chuckled. We'll push him out eventually, the president added, his tone cold, certain. I gritted my teeth until my jaw ached. They weren't just building cabins. They were building walls around me, slowly fencing me into a corner. My property had become the one thing they couldn't control, the one black mark on their perfect map. And that made me dangerous in their eyes, something to be removed. I walked down to the water and stared at the docks stretching across the lake. Their new wood gleamed gold in the dying light, but to me, it was nothing but rot. Rot that would spread, rot that would poison. For the first time, I realized they weren't going to stop. Not until my cabin was gone. Not until I was gone. And as the machines roared on, I felt something stir inside me. A sharpness, a resolve. They thought this was their lake now. They thought I was powerless. But they had forgotten one thing. The dam was still mine. The first time I sat across from a lawyer about the lake, I still believed in the system. His office smelled of stale coffee and cheap cologne, the blinds drawn halfway to shield us from the bright spring afternoon outside. He clicked his pen as I laid out photographs of the bridge before and after its destruction, copies of old land deeds, even a faded black and white photo of my father standing proudly by the dam he built with his bare hands. The lawyer barely glanced at them. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a sigh that felt rehearsed. Look, he said, I understand your frustration, but the HOA has a charter. They've got permits, signatures, and, well, frankly, they've got money. Fighting this will take years, and even then, I can't promise you'll win. I pressed forward, desperate. My father built that dam. The lake exists because of him. Doesn't that mean something? The lawyer gave me a pitying look, the kind reserved for someone who hasn't yet accepted defeat. What means something is paper, Mr. Hale? Paper and money. They got both. That was the first door slammed in my face. The second came a week later. I drafted a petition, spending nights at my kitchen table with a pot of black coffee and stacks of paper. I went door to door around the lake, pressing it into neighbors' hands, explaining that what the HOA was doing wasn't progress. It was theft erasure. Some were polite, offering half smiles before setting the petition aside. Others closed their doors before I finished speaking. They've promised to raise property values. One woman said, her voice tight with forced cheer. You should think about the bigger picture. The board said you're just bitter, a man muttered as he handed my petition back. That you don't understand business. By the time I reached the last cabin, my petition was still nearly blank, its columns of signature lines empty except for my own name scrawled across the top. That night, I burned the stack in the fireplace. Watching the pages curl in ash felt too familiar, like watching the bridge collapse all over again. The third rejection was the cruelest. The HOA held their monthly open meeting in a newly built clubhouse, its polished glass windows glowing warm against the darkness outside. I sat in the back, the lone shadow among rows of neighbors who now smiled and nodded at every word the board spoke. Richard, tall, silver-haired, and smug in his tailored suit, stood at the front with a microphone. His voice carried with the practiced rhythm of someone who believed every syllable he spoke was truth. We're proud to announce Phase 2 of the resort project, he said, his grin wide. Cabins are booking up months in advance. Property values are projected to rise another 20% this year alone. This, he gestured to a massive poster board behind him showing renderings of luxury docks and glimmering cabins, is progress. This is community. I raised my hand. My heart pounded as dozens of eyes turned toward me. Yes, Mr. Hale. Richard's tone dripped with false courtesy. You destroyed my bridge, I said, my voice sharp, echoing in the room. You've cut trees, scarred the shoreline, and turned a family lake into your personal piggy bank. My father built that dam with his hands, and you have no right to erase it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Richard let the silence drag before smirking. Some people, he said slowly, carefully, as though savoring the words, just don't belong in progress. The room erupted in laughter, sharp, dismissive, cruel. Even those who hadn't signed my petition chuckled, desperate not to look out of place. I stood frozen, the sound stabbing deeper than any insult. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just fighting the board. I was fighting the whole town. I walked out before the meeting ended, the echo of their laughter following me into the cold night. That night, I sat alone at the edge of the lake. The clubhouse lights glowed like an infection on the far shore, their reflections shattering the still water into broken pieces. I stared down at my hands, trembling with anger, but beneath the fury was something heavier. I thought about my father again, his rough hands gripping stones, his voice steady as he promised me the lake would always be ours. I thought about my mother, who had watched him work, who had whispered to me once, "This water will outlive us all." And I thought about the smirk on Richard's face. The rage I'd felt for weeks began to shift. It cooled, sharpened. Fury was fire, wild and uncontrollable. But what settled inside me that night was something else. Something colder. Something harder. Resolve. The HOA believed they had stripped me of everything: power, allies, even dignity. But they were blind. They saw my cabin as a relic, my presence as an obstacle, my voice as a joke. They had forgotten the truth my father had whispered years ago. Without the dam, they were nothing. I rose to my feet, staring across the water at the cabins rising like parasites along the shore. They had taken my bridge, mocked my name, poisoned my community. But the lake still listened. The dam still stood, and I still held the key. Breaking point wasn't rage exploding outward. It was silence, steel, and calculation settling into place. That night, under the weight of the stars and the echo of my father's promise, I made my choice. This war wouldn't be fought with petitions or lawyers. It would be fought with stone, water, and patience. And when it came, the flood would wash them all away. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the relentless roar of the river as it churned against the dam. The air carried the sharp tang of wet moss and pine, and the moon, low and swollen, bathed the valley in a ghostly silver glow. I stood at the riverbank, my breath visible in the chilly air, staring at the jagged outcrop of rocks and tangled brush that hid my father's secret. The hidden floodgate, a marvel of engineering, concealed so perfectly that even the workers who built the dam had never suspected its existence. My father had designed it as a fail-safe, a way to release the river's fury in a controlled manner if the dam ever faltered. Only a handful of people knew about it, and I was the only one left who carried the old iron key, its weight a constant reminder in my coat pocket. I hadn't thought about the gate in years, not since I was a boy trailing my father through the dam's labyrinthine corridors. His voice, steady and commanding, would echo off the concrete walls as he explained the mechanics of his creation. "This dam is our legacy, Ethan," he'd said, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "But every legacy has its shadow. Don't ever forget the gate." As a child, I thought he meant the dam's strength, its ability to tame the wild river that had flooded our valley for generations. But now, standing alone in the dark, I understood. The gate wasn't just a mechanism. It was a secret, a burden passed from father to son. The town below the dam had been restless for weeks. Whispers of strange happenings had spread like wildfire. Lights flickering in abandoned houses, footsteps echoing in empty alleys, and shadows darting through the woods where no one ventured after dusk. The river itself seemed alive, its currents twisting with an unnatural force, as if it were straining against the dam's restraint. I dismissed the rumors as small-town paranoia, but that changed 2 nights ago. At the tavern, old man Carver, his hands, trembling from age or fear, had slipped me a crumpled note. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's, though he'd been gone for a decade. "The gate must stay closed," it read. No explanation, no context, just those 5 words scrawled in fading ink. The note had haunted me, gnawing at my thoughts until I found myself here, at the far side of the dam, where the path was swallowed by thorns and thyme. My boots crunched against the frost-dusted gravel as I pushed through the overgrowth, the branches clawing at my sleeves like skeletal fingers. The memories came flooding back, my father's late-night sketches, the way he'd pause when I asked about the gate, his eyes distant as if he saw something I couldn't. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened," he'd said once, his voice low, almost a whisper. I hadn't understood then. I wasn't sure I understood now. I reached the outcrop, a chaotic pile of rocks and moss that blended seamlessly with the landscape. To anyone else, it was just nature's clutter, but I knew where to look. Kneeling, I brushed away layers of dirt and brittle leaves until my fingers grazed the cold, rusted edge of the gate. It was smaller than I remembered, barely wide enough for a man to slip through, yet it seemed to hum with a quiet, oppressive energy. My hand shook as I pulled the iron key from my pocket. It was heavier than it should have been, its surface etched with faint, spiraling symbols that caught the moonlight and seemed to writhe, just for a moment. I froze, my pulse hammering. Had those symbols always been there? I couldn't remember. The river's roar grew louder, almost a scream, as if it sensed my presence. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. I slid the key into the lock, the mechanism grinding with a deep, reluctant groan. For a heartbeat, I thought it wouldn't turn. Then, with a shudder that reverberated through the ground, the lock yielded. The gate trembled but held fast, its iron surface cold and unyielding. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel it, something on the other side, something vast and ancient, pressing against the metal like a held breath. Waiting. I stepped back, my mind racing. The note, the warnings, the strange happenings in the town. They all converged on this moment, this gate. But why? What had my father known? He'd told me stories as a child, tales of the river's spirit, of pacts made with forces older than the valley itself, forces that demanded respect or payment. I'd laugh them off, chalking them up to bedtime stories meant to scare a boy into behaving. But now, standing here, the stories didn't seem so childish. The river's voice was no longer just a sound. It was a call, urgent and insistent, weaving my name into its current. The wind shifted, carrying a low, guttural hum that seemed to rise from the gate itself. My grip tightened on the key, the metal biting into my palm. Open the gate, and I might uncover the truth about my father, the dam, the river. Keep it closed, and I might never know what lay behind it or why the town was unraveling. But my father's warning echoed in my mind. The gate must stay closed. I thought of the townsfolk, their faces etched with fear. I thought of the shadows in the woods, the lights in empty houses. And I thought of my father, his voice steady, but his eyes haunted, as if he'd seen what lay beyond the gate and wished he hadn't. The river's call grew louder, more desperate, and for a moment, I felt my hand twitch toward the lock. Then, from the darkness behind me, a twig snapped. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the woods were empty. Or were they? A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, gone before I could focus. The hum from the gate grew stronger, vibrating in my bones. I backed away, the key still clutched in my hand, my father's words a lifeline in the chaos of my thoughts. The gate must stay closed. But the river was still calling, and someone was watching. The moonlight sliced through the darkness, its pale glow rippling across the restless surface of the lake. Each stroke of the oars sent shivers through the water, as if the river itself knew what I was about to do. My small rowboat creaked under my weight, a fragile thing against the vast, brooding expanse of the dam's reservoir. My hands, slick with sweat despite the biting cold, gripped the oars tightly, but it was the weight of the iron key in my pocket that anchored me to this moment. The key to my father's hidden floodgate. The key to a secret I wasn't sure I wanted to unravel. I hadn't planned to come back. After standing at the gate 2 nights ago, feeling that oppressive presence behind the rusted iron, I'd sworn to leave it alone. My father's note, "The gate must stay closed," had burned itself into my mind, a warning I couldn't shake. But the town's unease had only grown. The flickering lights in abandoned houses had become constant, glowing with a sickly green hue that no one could explain. The shadows in the woods moved with purpose now, and last night, a child had gone missing, her laughter replaced by an eerie silence that hung over the valley. The townsfolk looked to me, the dam keeper's son, as if I held the answers. Maybe I did. The dam loomed ahead, a monolithic shadow against the starry sky, its concrete face scarred by decades of weather and time. I guided the boat to the far side, where the hidden gate lay concealed beneath rocks and brush. The current tugged at me, impatient, as if urging me to hurry. I tied the boat to a gnarled root jutting from the bank and climbed ashore, my boots sinking into the muddy earth. The air was thick with the scent of decay, rotting leaves, stagnant water, and something else, something metallic and wrong. I knelt before the outcrop, my heart pounding as I pushed aside the tangle of vines and stones. The gate was there, just as I'd left. Its rusted surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. The symbols etched into its frame, those strange, spiraling lines I'd noticed before, seemed to pulse, as if alive. I pulled the iron key from my pocket, its weight heavier than ever, and hesitated. The river's roar filled my ears, a low, guttural chant that seemed to whisper my name. "Ethan, open it." I shook my head, trying to clear the voice, but it lingered, curling around my thoughts like smoke. My hands shook as I fit the key into the old lock, rust grinding against rust with a sound that grated on my nerves. For a moment, the mechanism resisted, as if the gate itself were fighting me. Then, with a groan like the earth itself was waking, the lock gave way. The gate shuddered, and a low, hollow thud echoed through the valley. Water surged forward, a cold, relentless force that sprayed mist into the air and tugged at my boots. The gate swung open, revealing a dark, yawning tunnel beyond, its walls slick with algae and secrets. Decades of silence poured out with the water, a torrent of suppressed truths that seemed to carry voices, whispers, cries, fragments of something I couldn't quite grasp. I stumbled back, clutching the boat's rope to steady myself, and watched as the lake began to sink. The water level dropped slowly at first, then faster, exposing slimy rocks and forgotten debris along the shore. The river's chant grew louder, more insistent, and the air crackled with an electric charge. I felt in my bones a shift, a reckoning. Whatever my father had locked away behind that gate was no longer contained. Memories of him flooded back, his late-night vigils by the dam, the way he'd stare at the water as if it held answers he couldn't share. "The river remembers, Ethan," he'd said once, his voice heavy with something like regret. "It remembers everything." I hadn't understood then, but now, as the lake drained and the gate's dark mouth gaped before me, I wondered what he'd meant. What had he done to build this dam? What had he bargained with to tame the river? And why had he left me the key, knowing what it might unleash? A sudden noise, a sharp crack from the woods behind me, snapped me out of my thoughts. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the darkness revealed nothing. The shadows seemed thicker now, coalescing into shapes that flickered at the edge of my vision. The hum from the gate intensified, vibrating through the ground, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move inside the tunnel, a formless, shifting mass that wasn't water. My breath caught, and I gripped the key so tightly it bit into my palm. The town's fate rested on this moment. The missing child, the unnatural lights, the river's anger, it all led back to the gate. I could close it, lock it again, and hope the river would quiet. Or I could step into the tunnel, face whatever lay beyond, and find the truth my father had hidden. The water surged around my ankles, cold and unyielding, as if daring me to choose. From the darkness of the woods, a voice called my name. Not the river's, but something human, desperate. I turned, my heart in my throat, and saw a figure stumbling toward me, their face obscured by the shadows. The gate's hum grew deafening, and the lake continued to drain, pulling me toward a truth I wasn't sure I could face. The first light of dawn crept over the valley, a pale, reluctant glow that did little to warm the chaos unfolding below. The resort, once a gleaming jewel perched on the edge of the lake, was now a scene of devastation. The water that had defined its grandeur, sparkling under the sun, luring wealthy guests and ambitious investors, had vanished overnight, leaving behind a desolate expanse of cracked mud and glistening rocks. Boats, once bobbing proudly on the lake's surface, now lay stranded like beached whales, their hulls caked with slime. The grand docks, built at no small expense, tilted drunkenly into the mire, their polished wood splintered and useless. The air, once filled with the laughter of vacationers and the clink of champagne glasses, now carried the frantic shouts of guests, the wail of sirens, and the low, mournful hum that still lingered from the open floodgate. Ethan stood at the edge of the drained lake bed, his boots sinking into the muck, the iron key still heavy in his pocket. The events of the night replayed in his mind. The grinding of the lock, the surge of water through the hidden gate, the dark tunnel that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. He hadn't slept, hadn't dared to close his eyes since he'd rowed back to shore under the weight of what he'd done. The river's voice, that relentless chant that had called his name, had quieted, but its absence was no comfort. It had been replaced by a new sound, the cacophony of a resort unraveling, of an empire crumbling as the water that sustained it disappeared into the earth. The resort, named Lakeview Haven in a stroke of irony that now felt cruel, had been Richard Caldwell's brainchild. A shrewd businessman with a penchant for turning nature into profit, Richard had transformed the once quiet valley into a playground for the elite. The dam, built by Ethan's father decades ago, had created the lake, and Richard had seen opportunity where others saw only water. Hotels, restaurants, and luxury cabins had sprouted along the shore, their sleek designs a testament to his ambition. But now, as Ethan watched from the muddy bank, Richard stood on the resort's main terrace, his tailored suit rumpled, his face a mask of horror. The water, his empire's lifeblood, was gone, and with it, the illusion of invincibility he'd cultivated. Guests milled about in a state of panic, their designer luggage abandoned on the lawn as they demanded answers. "Where's the lake?" a woman in a silk robe shrieked, her voice piercing the morning air. "This is outrageous. We paid for a view." Others clustered near the drained lake bed, snapping photos of the surreal scene or arguing with staff who had no more answers than they did. A man in a golf shirt, likely one of Richard's investors, was shouting into his phone, his face red with fury. "Do you know how much I sank into this place? $1 million. And now it's a swamp." The staff, overwhelmed and undertrained for such a catastrophe, scurried between groups, offering weak apologies and bottled water, as if hydration could soothe the collapse of a dream. Ethan's gaze shifted to the dam in the distance, its concrete bulk looming over the valley like a silent judge. The hidden floodgate, now open, was invisible from here, but he could feel its presence, a wound in the earth that pulsed with consequences. He hadn't meant for this to happen. Not exactly. He'd opened the gate seeking answers, driven by his father's cryptic note and the strange happenings that had plagued the town. The flickering lights, the missing child, the shadows that moved with purpose. But now, standing amidst the wreckage of Richard's resort, he wondered if he'd unleashed something far worse than he'd imagined. Richard's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding despite the strain in his tone. "Ethan," he bellowed, striding across the lawn, his polished shoes sinking into the mud. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wild with desperation. "What the hell did you do?" The accusation hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby guests, who turned to stare at Ethan with a mix of curiosity and blame. "I didn't," Ethan started, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? That he'd opened a secret gate his father had built? That he'd acted on a hunch, driven by a note, and a feeling he couldn't explain? Richard didn't give him a chance to finish. "The lake is gone, Ethan." Richard gestured wildly at the muddy expanse. "Do you have any idea what this means? The investors are pulling out. The guests are threatening lawsuits. This resort, this entire valley, was built on that water, and now it's nothing but a goddamn puddle." His voice cracked, betraying the fear beneath his anger. "Your father built that dam. If anyone knows what's going on, it's you." Ethan's jaw tightened. Richard wasn't wrong. His father had built the dam and the gate and left behind a legacy of secrets that Ethan was only beginning to unravel. But Richard didn't know about the gate, the key, or the strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the moonlight. He didn't know about the hum that had vibrated through Ethan's bones, or the voice that had called his name from the river. And Ethan wasn't about to tell him. Not yet. "I don't know what happened," Ethan lied, his voice steady despite the guilt gnawing at him. "The dam's been here for decades. Maybe something gave way." Richard's eyes narrowed, searching Ethan's face for the truth. "Don't play dumb with me, kid. Your father was always tinkering with that dam, muttering about things nobody else understood. If there's a problem, you'd better fix it before this place goes under and takes you with it." The threat lingered, but Ethan held his ground, meeting Richard's gaze. He'd never liked the man, his arrogance, his greed, the way he'd turned the valley into a commodity. But Richard wasn't entirely wrong. The dam was Ethan's responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. His father had left him the key, the note, the burden. And now, with the lake gone and the town on edge, Ethan felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. Before he could respond, a scream pierced the air. It came from a lake bed, where a group of guests had gathered near one of the stranded boats. Ethan and Richard turned, their argument forgotten, as a woman stumbled back from the mud, her hands covering her mouth. "There's something down there," she cried, pointing at the exposed lake bed. "Something moving." Ethan's heart sank. He pushed past Richard and ran toward the crowd, his boots slipping in the muck. The guests parted, their faces pale, as he reached the spot where the woman was pointing. At first, he saw nothing but mud and debris, broken branches, old fishing nets, a rusted bicycle half buried in the silt. But then he saw it, a ripple in the mud, slow and deliberate, as if something beneath the surface were stirring. The crowd gasped, stepping back, and Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He knelt, his hands trembling as he brushed away the mud. Beneath it was a smooth, dark surface, not stone, not metal, but something organic, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. It was warm to the touch, despite the cold, and etched with the same spiraling symbols he'd seen on the floodgate. His breath caught as he realized what he was looking at. Not a relic of the lake, but something older, something that had been hidden beneath the water for decades, perhaps centuries. The hum from the gate returned, louder now, vibrating through the ground and into Ethan's chest. The crowd murmured, some backing away, others pulling out their phones to record the anomaly. Richard appeared at Ethan's side, his face ashen. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. "I don't know," Ethan said, but the lie tasted bitter. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he knew it was connected to the gate, to his father, to the river's restless anger. The symbols, the hum, the shadows in the woods, they were all pieces of a puzzle his father had left behind, a puzzle Ethan was only beginning to understand. Another scream rang out, this time from the woods beyond the resort. Ethan stood, his eyes scanning the tree line. The shadows were moving again, more distinct now, humanoid shapes that flickered in and out of sight. The guests scattered, some running for the hotel, others frozen in fear. Richard grabbed Ethan's arm, his grip bruising. "Fix this, Ethan," he hissed. "Whatever you did, undo it." But Ethan knew it wasn't that simple. The gate was open, the lake was draining, and something ancient was waking. His father's note echoed in his mind. The gate must stay closed. He'd ignored it, and now the valley was paying the price. The hum grew louder, the ground trembling beneath his feet, and from the lake bed, the pulsing thing began to rise, its surface glistening in the dawn light. In the distance, a child's voice called out, a voice Ethan recognized. The missing girl. She was alive, somewhere in the woods, and her cry was both a plea and a warning. Ethan's hand closed around the key in his pocket, its edges biting into his palm. He had to find her, had to close the gate, had to face whatever his father had feared. But as the shadows closed in and the lake bed stirred, he knew the morning's chaos was only the beginning. The river was awake, and it was hungry. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the muddy chaos of the drained lake bed, its polished wood and sterile air a world away from the river's restless hum. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling, the iron key still a heavy presence in his pocket. The weight of the past week pressed down on him. The open floodgate, the vanished lake, the resort's collapse, and the strange, pulsing thing he'd uncovered in the mud. Now he faced a new kind of reckoning, a lawsuit from the Lakeview Haven Homeowners Association, accusing him of sabotage, of deliberately destroying the resort that had been the valley's economic lifeline. The accusation stung, but not as much as the truth he was still piecing together, the truth his father had hidden behind the dam's secret gate. The courtroom buzzed with tension. The gallery was packed with townsfolk, resort staff, and angry investors, their whispers a low drone that mingled with the creak of wooden benches. Richard Caldwell, the resort's mastermind, sat in the front row, his face a mask of controlled fury, his suit as immaculate as ever despite the mud-stained empire he'd lost. The HOA's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Hensley, stood at the plaintiff's table, her voice crisp as she laid out their case. Ethan Marshall, she declared, pointing at him, knowingly and maliciously opened an unauthorized floodgate, draining Lakeview Haven's reservoir and causing irreparable financial damage. His actions were not only reckless but intentional sabotage, motivated by personal vendetta against the progress this resort represents. Ethan's lawyer, a grizzled public defender named Tom Grayson, leaned close, his breath smelling of coffee and tobacco. "Keep your cool, kid," he muttered. "They've got no proof you meant to tank the place. Let them talk themselves into a corner." Ethan nodded, but his stomach churned. He hadn't meant to destroy the resort. Not exactly. He'd opened the gate seeking answers, driven by his father's cryptic note. The gate must stay closed, and the strange happenings that had gripped the town, the flickering lights, the missing child, the shadows that moved with purpose. But intent didn't matter when the lake was gone. The docks were useless, and something ancient was stirring beneath the valley. The HOA's case seemed airtight at first. Margaret presented photos of the drained lake bed, financial records showing millions in losses, and testimonies from resort staff who claimed Ethan had been seen rowing to the dam the night the water vanished. "This man," she said, her voice rising, "is the son of the dam's builder, privy to its secrets. He alone had access to the mechanisms that caused this catastrophe." The gallery murmured, and Ethan felt their eyes boring into him, a mix of anger and fear. To them, he was no longer just the dam keeper's son. He was the man who drowned their livelihoods. But Tom Grayson had been digging, and what he'd uncovered turned the tide. As the HOA's case rested, he stood, his rumpled suit a stark contrast to Margaret's polished demeanor. "Your Honor," he began, his voice gravelly but firm, "the plaintiff accuses my client of sabotage, but let's talk about the real crime here. The Lakeview Haven HOA has been engaged in unlawful practices for years, practices that strip this valley of its heart and soul." He held up a stack of documents, their edges worn but their contents damning. "These are records of the HOA's unauthorized demolition of a historic bridge, Ethan's Bridge, built by his father to connect the town to the dam. They tore it down to expand their resort, without permits or consultation." The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. Ethan's heart pounded as memories of the bridge flooded back, its sturdy wooden planks, the view of the river from its center, the way his father had carved their initials into its railing. It had been more than a structure. It was a symbol of his family's bond to the valley, erased without a trace to make way for Richard's luxury cabins. Tom wasn't done. These documents, he continued, slapping another stack on the table, detail the HOA's illegal land grabs. They coerced residents into selling their properties at below-market prices, using intimidation and forged deeds. And here, he held up a ledger, its pages marked with red ink, are records of backroom deals between the HOA and local officials, ensuring their projects faced no oversight. They built their empire on stolen land and broken laws, and now they have the audacity to accuse Ethan Marshall of sabotage when he was merely reclaiming what's his. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and sharper eyes, leaned forward, her gaze cutting through the room. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Grayson," she said. "Do you have evidence to substantiate them?" "We do, Your Honor," Tom replied, producing affidavits from former town officials and residents who'd been pressured by the HOA. One, a frail woman named Clara, took the stand, her voice trembling but resolute. "They threatened to cut off my water if I didn't sell," she said, tears in her eyes. "That bridge was my husband's pride, and they tore it down like it was nothing." Another witness, a former surveyor, testified to falsified maps that expanded the resort's boundaries onto protected land. The evidence piled up, each revelation a crack in the HOA's facade. Margaret Hensley's composure faltered, her arguments growing shrill as she tried to redirect blame to Ethan. "This is irrelevant," she snapped. "The defendant's actions caused millions in damages, regardless of the HOA's past." But the judge's expression was unyielding, and the gallery's mood had shifted. The townsfolk, once quick to blame Ethan, now whispered about Richard and the HOA, their anger turning toward the real culprits. Ethan's mind drifted as the courtroom drama unfolded. He thought of the floodgate, the pulsing thing in the lakebed, the child's voice he'd heard in the woods. The HOA's greed was only part of the story, a human failing in a valley haunted by something older, something tied to the river and his father's secrets. He'd opened the gate to find answers, but all he'd found was chaos. And yet, the key in his pocket felt heavier, as if urging him to finish what he'd started. The judge's voice snapped him back to the present. "This court has heard enough," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "The plaintiff's accusations of sabotage are unsubstantiated. Ethan Marshall's actions, while reckless, do not constitute intentional malice. But more importantly, the evidence presented reveals a pattern of misconduct by the Lakeview Haven HOA. You cannot steal from a man and cry foul when he takes back what's his." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The lawsuit is dismissed. Furthermore, I'm recommending a full investigation into the HOA's practices." The gavel fell, and the courtroom exploded into noise. Richard stood, his face pale, as investors swarmed him, their voices a chorus of outrage. Margaret gathered her papers, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Tom clapped Ethan on the shoulder, a rare grin breaking through his grizzled exterior. "You're free, kid," he said, "but don't go opening any more gates." Ethan nodded, but his relief was fleeting. The courtroom victory meant little when the valley was still unraveling. The missing girl, Sarah, was out there, her voice haunting his dreams. The thing in the lakebed was still stirring, its symbols mirroring those on the floodgate, and the shadows in the woods were growing bolder, their shapes more defined with each passing night. The judge's words echoed in his mind. You cannot steal from a man and take back what's his. But what if the river itself was claiming something back, something older than the dam, older than the valley? As Ethan left the courthouse, the key burned in his pocket, a reminder of his father's warning and the gate he couldn't close. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the town, and in the distance, the dam loomed, silent but alive with secrets. Sarah's voice called again, faint but unmistakable, from the direction of the woods. Ethan's hand tightened around the key. The HOA had lost, but the real consequences were still coming, and they were not bound by any court. The river was watching, and it was not done. The sun hung high over the valley, its harsh light casting long shadows across the cracked, desolate lakebed. What was once Lakeview Haven's shimmering centerpiece, a pristine reservoir that drew tourists and investors like moths to a flame, was now a vast expanse of sun-baked mud, littered with the detritus of a fallen empire. Stranded boats tilted in the silt, their hulls peeling under the relentless heat. The grand docks, once the pride of the resort, sagged into the earth, their splintered planks a mockery of the luxury they'd promised. The resort itself stood abandoned, its sleek hotels and cabins silent, their windows dark and gaping like the eyes of corpse. For $1 million worth of ambition rotted in the sun, a monument to hubris brought low by a single turn of an iron key. Ethan Marshall walked the dry lake bed, his boots crunching against the hardened mud, each step a reclaiming of the land his father had shaped. The air was thick with the scent of decay, rotting algae, exposed fish bones, and the faint, metallic tang that lingered from the thing he'd uncovered days ago, that pulsing, symbol-etched mass buried in the silt. The iron key, still heavy in his pocket, seemed to hum faintly, a reminder of the gate he'd opened and the consequences he'd unleashed. The resort was gone, the HOA defeated in court, their greed laid bare by Tom Grayson's relentless evidence of land grabs and backroom deals. The judge's words still echoed in Ethan's mind. You cannot steal from a man and cry foul when he takes back what's his. And he had taken it back. Not just the lake, not just the land, but the power the HOA and Richard Caldwell had wielded over the valley. The silence of the lake bed was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of a collapsing dock or the distant cry of a hawk circling above. No HOA rules govern this place now. No greedy board dictated what could be built or who could walk here. It was just Ethan, the soil, and the faint echo of his father's promise. A promise made years ago when they'd stood together on the dam, looking out over the newly formed lake. This is ours, Ethan, his father had said, his voice steady but his eyes haunted. The river gave it to us, but it's not ours to keep. It's a loan, and one day it'll want it back. Ethan hadn't understood then, but now, with the lake drained and the resort in ruins, he felt the truth of those words. The river had reclaimed what was its, and Ethan had been its instrument. He paused near the center of the lake bed, where the mud was still soft, clinging to his boots like a living thing. This was where he'd seen it, that strange, pulsing mass, its surface warm and etched with the same spiraling symbols as the floodgate. He'd covered it back up after the chaos of that morning, unwilling to let the panicked guests or Richard's investors see it, but he could still feel its presence, a heartbeat beneath the earth. It wasn't just a relic or a geological oddity. It was connected to the river, to the dam, to the secrets his father had guarded with that cryptic note. The gate must stay closed. Ethan had ignored the warning, and now the valley was changed, scarred, yes, but free. He turned, his gaze sweeping the abandoned resort. The main hotel, a glass-and-steel monstrosity, loomed on the hill, its once pristine facade streaked with dust and bird droppings. The luxury cabins, scattered along the former shoreline, were already succumbing to neglect, their roofs sagging under the weight of fallen branches. Richard Caldwell was gone, last seen driving out of town with a convoy of investors, their faces grim as they abandoned their sinking ship. The HOA board had scattered too, some facing criminal investigations after the court's ruling exposed their corruption. Ethan had won, but the victory felt hollow. The land was his again, but at what cost? The townsfolk had mixed feelings. Some hailed him as a hero, the dam keeper's son who'd brought down the greedy resort that had priced them out of their homes. Others whispered that he'd gone too far, that draining the lake had unleashed something unnatural. The flickering lights in abandoned houses had stopped, but the woods were still restless, shadows moving at night. And Sarah, the missing girl, hadn't been found. Ethan had heard her voice that night by the floodgate, a desperate cry from the woods, but searches had turned up nothing. He'd gone back every day since, combing the tree line, calling her name, but the forest was silent, as if guarding its own secrets. He knelt, running his hand over the cracked mud. The lake bed was scarred, its surface a patchwork of fissures and debris, but it was his. His father had built the dam to tame the river, to create this lake, but he'd also built the hidden gate, a failsafe Ethan now understood was more than mechanical. It was a pact, a balance struck with forces older than the valley, forces that demanded respect. By opening the gate, Ethan had broken that pact, and the river had answered. But why had his father left him the key? Why entrust him with a secret that could undo everything? The faint hum from the key grew stronger, vibrating against his thigh. He pulled it out, its iron surface catching the sunlight, the spiraling symbols glinting like liquid fire. They were clearer now, more intricate, as if the act of opening the gate had awakened them. Ethan traced a finger over the patterns, half expecting them to move, but they remained still, a silent challenge. He thought of his father's stories, tales of the river's spirit, of deals made in the shadows of the valley, of a time when the land and water were one. He dismissed them as folklore, but now, with the lake gone and the thing in the lake bed stirring, he wasn't so sure. A sound broke his reverie, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps behind him. Ethan spun, his heart racing, but the lake bed was empty. The shadows at the edge of the woods flickered, too quick to follow, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure, a child, perhaps, her silhouette fleeting against the trees. "Sarah?" he called, his voice hoarse. The only answer was the wind, carrying that same metallic tang he'd smelled by the gate. He stood, gripping the key, and took a step toward the woods, but something stopped him, a pulse in the ground, faint but unmistakable, like the one he'd felt in the lake bed. He turned back to the spot where he'd uncovered the mass. The mud was undisturbed, but the air above it shimmered, a heat haze where none should be. The hum grew louder, not just from the key, but from the earth itself, a low, resonant song that seemed to call his name. "Ethan." He froze, his breath shallow. The river was gone, but its voice remained, woven into the soil, the air, the valley. It wasn't angry anymore, but it wasn't satisfied either. It wanted something more than the lake, more than the resort's ruin. He thought of his father's promise, not just to him, but to the valley. "We hold the river, but it holds us too," he'd said, his eyes fixed on the water as if it could see him. Ethan had drained the lake, broken the HOA's grip, reclaimed the land, but the river's claim was older, deeper. The thing in the lake bed, the shadows in the woods, Sarah's voice, they were all part of it, pieces of a truth his father had known and died keeping.